What is good? Welcome back to the channel. So I'm sure you've heard about pushing film. You're probably wondering what the hell is pushing film? Well, I actually gave it a shot with some Portra 400, and I'm gonna give you some information about my experience. Before we jump into some details, let's check out this little kind of fake mini movie I made. I'm not a cinematographer, but I'm a creative person, so I figured I'd give it a shot. Let's check it out. All right, I hope you enjoyed that. It was a little interesting making that. Like I said, I'm not a cinematographer and I don't have cinema cameras or any of that stuff, but it was fun to mess around with some video and combine it with some photos. So there you go. But in all of those photos right there, I was shooting Portra 400 pushed by one stop. So what exactly does pushing film mean? Well, pushing film means you expose, or I guess you rate your film at an ISO that is higher than the ISO actually labeled on the film, and therefore you expose your film for a much shorter time. So for example, Portra 400, if you rate it normally for any given exposure, let's say, the metering was 1/250th of a second. If you push your film one stop, then you're actually quote unquote rating it at 800, which means that your shutter speed has to compensate. And therefore your shutter speed is now 1/500th of a second. So between 1/250th and 1/500th, that's one stop. And when you do that, you effectively giving your film less light. So what do you then do in developing? Well, you have to develop the film for longer in order to make up for that less light that you gave the film. And how much longer that you give it during developing depends on the kit that you're using. It also depends on whether it's black and white or color. In all these examples today, I'm going to talk about color, but for black and white, it's kind of similar. All right, so when should you actually push your film? What are some good scenarios? Well, I think there's two key ones. Number one is when you're doing street photography and you're zone focusing. When you zone focus, typically, you're using your lens at f8 or f16. But if your film is, let's say, ISO 100, that might still be a little bit too slow in order to actually get, acceptable shutter speeds at f8 or f16. For example, typically with street photography, you want to be somewhere in the 1/125th of a second or higher. And that's because if you're zone focusing, you're kind of being quick, you turn and hit and click on your camera. And all that motion, might affect your image. The faster your shutter speed, the less impact that motion is going to have on your actual shutter speed. And you don't want any of that. You want, sharper image typically. So by rating your film at a higher ISO, you can then shorten that shutter speed to, 1/25th, 1/250th, 1/500th, and get sharper images. And that's very common with street photography, unless you're shooting, Portra 800. And that stuff's expensive. If you use, a 100 speed film, that's probably gonna be cheaper, and therefore potentially you save some money by pushing cheaper film than buying Portra 800, for example. So that's number one. The second scenario where pushing film is actually useful is in low light situations. But there's a caveat here. With low light situations, you wanna have a scene that actually has light. You don't want a scene that's just, literally the absence of light. Because for example, in this shot right here, you can see kind of in the far off end of this image, there's just no light. There's no street lights, there's no building lights, nothing, and therefore it's dark. And a dark scene like that, pushing is not gonna make a difference. Pushing is useful in low light when you actually have light that's hitting your subject in a meaningful way. So because of that, you can actually, make an impression on the film with the light, and then by pushing the film and developing accordingly, you're just getting more out of that film. You're kind of developing it longer to really beef up, the highlights and the shadows there. But if there's no light to begin with, it's not gonna make a difference. I'm no chemistry major, but all I know is if you try to push film in a situation where there's no light at all, it's not gonna make a difference. You need to have a scene that actually has light, and therefore then you can push it and actually, try to bring more out of that negative. And doing so properly in those kind of correct scenarios will actually give you dense negatives that have information on it. The last thing you want is to have a negative that is not dense at all because of the fact that there's just no light in the scene. So how do you actually push film? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the key thing is that in camera, you expose your film to light for a shorter amount of time. So if you're shooting with your camera and the original meter reading gave you, let's say 1/160th of a second, well, when you're pushing the film, you're actually gonna expose that individual shot for 1/125th of a second. And that distinction there is one stop. Then when you develop the film, then you're actually going to develop for longer according to the kit. I use the Tetanol kit for my color film currently, and in there it says 30 extra seconds when pushing your film. So if the normal developing time, let's say, was 3 minutes and 15 seconds, when you push by one stop, it's gonna be 3 minutes and 45 seconds. It's pretty straightforward, but I highly recommend that when you push film, you try to use fresh chemicals, because the older your chemicals are, the harder it gets to really pinpoint how much more time you have to give your film in developing in order to get a properly dense negative. And of course, if you're developing at a lab, you can ask them to push, but I do find a lot of labs actually charge you more for pushing film because they then have to develop your film by itself during one kind of dev run, as opposed to being able to do it with all of the film that's already in the tank at once. So it's doable, but just know that you're gonna have to probably pay a little bit more. So let's actually look at two examples here. We'll look at a good example first. I think in this scenario, pushing worked fantastic. As you can see, you've got proper kind of dynamic range throughout the image, and the shadows don't look muddy, the colors don't look insane. It kind of looks proper. And the reason I think this worked out is because this scene actually had light. It wasn't tons of light because it was, nighttime, but the scene was lit in a variety of ways by the backlight, the light from the little LED light that I had. All of the above actually had a usable scene that had plenty of light despite being a low light scenario. And therefore, when you push, you're not gonna notice that much of an effect. You're actually gonna push and get really usable and good results. If we look at this example here, I think this is an example where there just wasn't enough light in the scene, and therefore when you develop it, you're gonna get all kinds of craziness happening. Of course, here there's a light leak in this image as well, so if you can disregard the blue, I think that'll kind of help. But in general, this scene just did not have enough light, and therefore in the shadows, it's gonna start to get really muddy, and you're gonna see a lot more grain and noise, and the colors are gonna shift. It's just not ideal. And I think those are the scenarios where you don't want to push film, because I don't think you're gonna get very usable results. So in general, do I recommend pushing film? I 100% recommend it. I think it's a good way to potentially save money. It's also a good way to really get the most out of your camera and the environment around you. If you don't have, Portra 800 or Cinestill 800T on you, and it's a lower light situation, some people might just not want to shoot at all. Whereas I think others might say, if I push this film, I could probably get some pretty good results here as long as I'm careful and meter appropriately. So I definitely recommend you do it. Just one thing to note, this might be obvious already, but you should only push film when you're doing it to the entire roll. If you're going to have one roll in your camera and then shoot the first half of the roll normal and then push the second half, that's not really gonna work, because when you develop it, you're developing the entire thing at once. Now, if you wanna go in the dark and cut your film somehow and cut it exactly where you think you should cut it, and then develop one half of the film regular and the other half push, that could work. But that's gonna be pretty hard unless you kind of leave a lot of space somewhere in the middle and somehow you can do that in the dark. But in general, when you push film, you want to do it to the entire roll. That way you don't have to deal with, doing all of that in the dark and trying to figure it out. All right, y'all, let me know what your experience is with pushing film. I've tried Portra 400 in this video, and I only did it one stop, but I know some people get crazy and, do 2, 3, even 4 stops with different film stocks. So let me know what was your favorite experience with that. All right, y'all, that's the video for today. If you enjoyed it, of course, go ahead and like, and go ahead and subscribe if you're not subscribed. I don't say that much, but I feel like I should say it because sometimes you forget to subscribe. All right, y'all, to the next video. I'm out.